would it make the ding ding sound? Okay. All right, so I did that, other than one person, I graded all your papers. And I will say more about the revising and resubmitting process on Wednesday. Assuming you've submitted a paper, I have graded all of them except for, like I said, one person. So I will say more about that on Wednesday. So I'll say more about the paper. You should at least have a grade for your first draft. And you won't be required to revise your paper. That will be an optional thing that you can do, but I'll say more about that. The other thing to say is I need to look at the syllabus here. I might need to change some things around. So, let's take a look. So we are also just as this is just a general thing I pointed out to my other class this morning, but this is an important date to be aware of. I think not necessarily just for this class. I mean, it may be for this class depending on what you're deciding about. But for any of your classes, that's just an important date to be aware of, because I think after that date, it's not possible to get that W anymore. You're locked into the class at that point, and you might get you'll have some letter grade. So just be aware that that's this coming Friday. And I'm not just saying that for this class, but for any of your classes. So we're not going to have class Friday because I have a that came up that fortunately will preclude me from being here. I'm sure you're disappointed on the Friday before spring break that we don't have class. So that means we are going to push. We're going to have to push this reading until next week, and it also means that for those of you in this third group, I'm going to have to push that until after spring break as well. So if you're in that third group, you're not going to have anything due this coming Friday. Okay. So you will have something due after spring break. Everybody will still be doing the same amount of work because two groups have already submitted their second one, but the third group hasn't submitted their second one yet. But that will be due. We'll cover Charles Mills when you guys get back from spring. Are there any questions about? So no class Friday. We are going to have a quiz on Rawls on Wednesday. I will post an announcement with topics. I know it probably feels like we've been talking about Rawls forever. At least for some of you, it may feel that way. So we will have a quiz. I'll post an announcement with topics ahead of time. Yes.
So,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
For group 3, so we're not doing it on this week's readings. We'll do it for.
You'll do it on this week.
This week's okay.
Sorry, the week when we get back from spring break.
Okay.
That week's not this week. That's week's. Yes. Okay. Everybody clear about that? Yes.
Do we have any assignments or anything we're responsible for over spring break?
Well, potentially, yes. The paper revisions, potentially, if you choose to, and there may be a small thing, because besides the quiz on Wednesday, we will do a group work in class, and there may be a small assignment that goes along with that. Okay. Are there any other questions as it relates to? You'll confuse me.
I'm sorry. So the group 3 will be due April 1st?
Yes.
Okay. I know it is.
Everybody good?
What is this Wednesday?
Quiz is Wednesday. I will post an announcement with the topics before Wednesday's class, so you have an idea of what's on. Any other questions? Any other questions?
Probably should ask you later, but revisions are due when we get back from spring.
I'll say more about that on Wednesday.
Okay. No worries.
Any other questions? So, will the assignment use the readings for this? No. For those of you in group 3, when you have something due, you'll just use these readings. Don't worry about this week's readings. Okay? Everybody clear? So, and now I may subsequently, I'm going to be running out of time here towards the end of the semester, but I may subsequently adjust some more due dates for things depending on where things stand. I really only have 1 week here to kind of play with, so I'll say more about that when the after you guys get back. Okay. Are Any other questions? So what I wanted to do on the final day, so again, we will have a quiz Wednesday, we will do group work after. I thought it might be helpful to kind of take stock and sort of overview everything from roles. And so what I wanted to do, I think what's helpful is to kind of have the various other proposals of justice that we've considered. Even though, and this has come up in the context of the Sandel readings. Right? Of course, when we just read from the primary text of Rawls, and we were just reading about Rawls, but Sandel has sort of introduced us to some other ways of thinking about justice. And justice here is largely concerned with, again, we're concerned with distributed, distributive, right? That is the framework for thinking about justice. There are other kinds of justice. One of the things that some of you have raised in your questions about Rawls, at least as I've been reading them, or at least a few of you did, has to do with questions about something like restorative justice, might be another kind of justice. Compensatory justice, where you attempt to remedy past wrongs in the present, something like that. Something like affirmative action might be something that's based on something like restorative or compensatory justice, where you're compensating for something in the past and the present. But that's not, here we're talking about the distribution of rights, and liberties, and income, and equality, and all those kinds of things. How should we distribute those things? And we've got several different models now in front of us to think about the best way to try and distribute those things. And all of them agree with Rawls to some extent. Right, so we have the libertarian conception that's mentioned in the reading by Sandel. The libertarian conception agrees with Rawls insofar as his first principle says we need to guarantee basic political rights and liberties. Everybody should have access and be guaranteed under the Constitution the same basic rights and the same basic liberties, regardless of who you are. That's something that all of these theories of justice agree. And so specifically as it relates to political questions, that's something that all three theories agree. Those are all things you're familiar with: the right to vote, right to free speech, all those things. But when it comes to economic justice, the libertarian would largely leave that up to the market to determine the levels of income and wealth. That's not something that the government should have a say in from the libertarian perspective. So guarantee basic political liberties, but beyond that, economic and income rights, as it relates to rights to income and income, that should be left up to the market. In other words, there's nothing politically that should be stopping you from achieving what you want with your life. Depending on what the market values, of course, some people will make less money, other people will make more. Maybe you have to adjust your decisions depending on what the market values. But at the end of the day, according to a libertarian, that is the most free kind of system we could have, because it leaves it up to a system of voluntary exchange based on market forces of supply and demand. Now, beyond that system, another system we could call the meritocratic one, which would agree with libertarianism insofar as it says we should, again, also guarantee basic political rights and liberties. Guarantee those things. None of these say that there's a basis to deny somebody basic political rights. None of them suggest it. But where it disagrees with libertarianism is it goes one step further. It says beyond formal equality of opportunity that we can find under a market system, the government also needs to guarantee some things so that everybody can have the same starting point. So the government does need then, so what I've said is we need to guarantee some social rights, I suppose, are what I'm calling them, in terms of healthcare and education. So this is something that the meritocratic system thinks this doesn't go far enough, because even if we guarantee political rights, some people are still going to be left behind through no fault of their own. So we need to guarantee access to things like housing, maybe, things like education and things like healthcare. Those are all things that there should be a minimum standard that everybody should have access to through no fault of their own. So that is basically if you remember for Rawls, there were two parts to his, he had his first principle, which was the political principle, but then he also had the second principle, which had A and B. A was the equality of opportunity. And that's what this is. This is fair equality of opportunity, not just formal. Formal is more in the abstract. Whereas here, now we have said, from this perspective, we've said, once we guarantee access to housing, once we guarantee access to healthcare, and once we, again, a minimum standard, right? Of course, people are going to have better and worse healthcare, better and worse housing, better and worse education, but there's at least a minimum standard that society thinks should be acceptable for all citizens. And so once we correct for those things, then we can still leave income and wealth up to the market. Once the social contingencies are accommodated. Does that make sense? Or not? Everybody with me so far? So you see how this one goes beyond this. This one says political rights aren't enough. We need to guarantee some basic social rights, which I'm calling social. I don't know if that's the best way to call them, but that's what I'm calling them. But then income and wealth, in other words, the economic is still largely a domain that is still up to the market. Rawls goes one step further, right? This is where Rawls goes one step further. Because Rawls gives, right? So Rawls does give the political principle, guarantee basic liberties and rights. Rawls also says we should guarantee equality of opportunity, but he goes one step further. And he says, even with income and wealth, the government should have some role to play. The state should have some role to play in determining what is a fair and just scheme of income and wealth. Right, so his difference principle, of course, is meant to do just that. It's meant to try and level out income and wealth. Because so again, fair equality of opportunity still isn't enough. Because, and this is what we talked about last week. Because somebody might say, okay, the government, the state sets up housing, some basic level housing, right? It sets up basic levels to healthcare, things like Medicaid and Medicare. It sets up education for things like grants, federally funded student loans, federally funded grants. These are all things that the federal government does. But even once we've guaranteed that, we still haven't accounted for all of the contingency associated with human life. There's still contingency that has to be accounted for according to Rawls. And that has to do with all the way down to effort and talents. And this is what we talked about on Friday, and we talked about this last week. Even things like our ability to work hard is something that is not entirely up to us. Or talents that allow us to work hard. The fact that I was gifted to be a certain physical specimen that allows me to go out and put a ball in a cylinder and make a bunch of money. To put it in its most crude terms. That's also contingent. I don't necessarily deserve everything I get because those talents that enabled me to do that in the first place, I didn't choose those about myself. So that is what, at the level of the economic, Rawls thinks there's still some injustice that needs to be accounted for. So I don't know if that, my hope was with doing this that really kind of puts it into perspective, what's going on here. Does that make sense? And so this is really where we pick up with today's reading, because income and wealth, right, for the libertarian and the meritocratic model, they had left income and wealth basically up to the market. Rawls says, no, there is some role for governmental policy here to ensure that we don't have levels of inequality that are harming the lowest percentage of society. that the government does have some obligation to play in setting up a system that doesn't harm those at the bottom. That's what the goal of the difference principle is, and I think by this point you basically understand. And so, what he does in today's reading, in other words, why are income and wealth contingent? Well, one of them is we don't own our talents. That's one reason. We don't own our talents. The fact that Michael Jordan is freakishly good at playing basketball, it doesn't mean he doesn't have to practice and work hard. But not everybody that practices and works hard is really good at basketball, and I'm sure you know that. We probably went to school with people. The percentage of people that make it to the pros is like 0. If you actually were to do the calculations, the percentage of college athletes that actually go pro is negligible. It's minuscule, right? And so we don't own our talents. And so what that means is the fact that we don't own our talents means that we don't deserve the wealth that we get. We don't deserve that. And that is really what cuts at the meritocratic core. Meritocratic thinking puts a one-to-one link between effort and hard work and success. And it says, if you work hard, you deserve success. And what Rawls is saying is, income and wealth are not a matter of what we deserve. They're a matter of what we're entitled to. That's the distinction that comes out in today's reading. Between what we deserve and what we're entitled to. And also, again, just real quick, there are 2 contingencies as to why income and wealth are not just a matter of our own doing. Income and wealth depend upon us not owning our talents. And this is another thing that several of you have brought up already, but that's in today's reading is we don't choose what society values. We have no control over what society values. And so he gives several examples in today's reading that tries to demonstrate that. The fact that a school teacher makes poverty level wages and I don't know, the host of the Tonight Show makes, $200 million or something, right? We have no control over what society values. And so those are all contingencies that need to be taken into account when we're asking about economic justice. So in other words, just leaving it up to the forces of the market, there's still a lot of contingency involved. Now, again, your response could be, you can go too far and attempt to overcorrect. And that's really what we get in the end of today's reading. We get 2 different visions. We get a quote from this guy, Milton Friedman, who was a prominent economist. Is it Milton Friedman or was it somebody else? Hyatt. Is it Friedman or Hyatt? We get a quote at the end of today's reading from this guy who was a big economist during the 1980s, Friedman, right? Who was writing during the 1980s, and if this president that you may have heard of named Ronald Reagan during the 1980s. This is really where the whole notion of trickle-down economics really comes from, and it's, you really get this really strong emphasis on, market thinking and trickle down and all that stuff, right? And Friedman is a prominent proponent of that kind of thing. But we'll get there in a moment. I want to focus on this difference, though, between desert and have you ever thought of this distinction? What you deserve and what you're entitled to? Have you ever thought about it in those terms? What's the distinction? Why does this matter? Why does this matter? Why is just, in other words, according to Rawls, why is justice more a matter of what you're entitled to rather than what you deserve?
So would entitlement be more like the standard, and then desert is like what you put effort for?
Yeah, but even your effort, yes, but
It's hard to put the right word.
I see what you're saying, but again, even for Rawls, this is the story we tell ourselves. This is the meritocratic story that we tell ourselves. That if you work hard and put in effort, you deserve success. Rawls is telling us that that's a fantasy. I'm putting it, I'm over speaking Rawls here, but to some extent, the meritocratic system, it is a story we tell ourselves, it's more of a story we tell ourselves rather than an actual reality. So I see what you're saying, but I'm just trying to, why does Rawls say that justice matters more about this than this? What's in today's reading here? Did you start to raise your hand?
I was thinking about it, but then when you said effort, I kind of stopped. But for me, it was easy to think about like deserving versus entitlement in like a legal justice sense, where like we can't say that just because someone, supposedly committed a crime, they don't deserve like legal counsel. I kind of thought of it that way.
They're entitled.
entitled to
They're
legal
entitled.
counsel. Yeah,
And that would be a political right,
yeah.
right? That would be a political right. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So that, yeah, maybe that's helpful. So they don't necessarily deserve it, you might say, because, you might just think they just get to have the book thrown at them and thrown in jail, right? That's what they deserve. But we don't think that that's fair. And so we recognize that they are entitled under a political constitution to account. Okay. So is there any way we can translate that into economic? You talk about, you give some examples about winning the lottery, the Red Sox. What are those examples supposed to show? What is that? What's the lottery example supposed to show? Is somebody who wins the lottery, are they, how does that play? Are they entitled or do they deserve the money? What's that? Well, they got lucky, right? So there's no sense in which we would say that they deserve the money, but they are entitled to it because they won. Nobody else is entitled to it. They got the winning ticket, right? Isn't that what? Yeah. To an extent, the virtue vice distinction is also something that Rawls is actually going to disagree with. Rawls doesn't think that justice is a matter of rewarding certain skills, because even those skills are contingent. In some ways, what you're referring to there is, without realizing it, Sandel's own views about justice are creeping in there a little bit, because Sandel has a disagreement with Rawls. When it comes to virtue and vice, he's an Aristotelian about virtues and vices. So he slightly disagrees there, but I see why you refer to that passage. What about the Red Sox? What about when a team wins the World Series? Do they deserve to win or are they entitled? What is that distinction? What does he say? What would it mean that they deserve to win?
So they're entitled to the win because of the structure of the league, and they deserve to win because they applied themselves to get to where they were and win.
So they played by the rules.
Right.
And that's why they're entitled to it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, sure.
That has a lot to do with how we're translating this into what we're thinking about here. Being entitled to something means that you play by the rules. That has a lot to do with it.
I was just gonna say, like, entitlement seems more like a property of the system that you're operating, and then desert is more like a property of the individual.
Like chocolate cake?
Yeah, sure.
No, that's fair. So this is more of the individual. Why do you say that? Why does it seem more societal? Or maybe systemic is a better word. What led you to that? To think about it like that? Was there something about the Red Sox example that led you to think about it like that? That's
I'm
okay.
trying to phrase it.
I mean, I think you're right. I'm just trying to figure out what it is that led you to think about it that way. There is something about entitlement that has to do with setting up a fair system. And that if you set up a fair system, whatever you achieve within the confines of those rules that govern the system, you are entitled to that. But you don't deserve it. Because to deserve it would then go back to the claim about effort. and what society values. And your effort and what society values, you have nothing to do. Nothing. I mean, I'm not gonna say, I mean, I realize how sort of that could sound like an overstatement. You have something. But there is a lot of contingency associated with what you were born with in terms of your genetics. There's a lot of contingency associated with that. And there's also a lot of contingency associated with what society values. And so what we have to say is use your efforts and use your talents within a system that is fair. And whatever you achieve within that system, you are entitled to. That's what I mean, that is the name of the game. Rawls' difference principle is, that's the rule of the game that we're talking about. The rule of the game that Rawls is giving us to try to regulate and talk about economic distribution is the difference principle. So in a system, for example, where you worked hard, you paid your taxes, you didn't try to cheat on your taxes. You worked hard, you are entitled to keep the part of your money that's yours. You're entitled to it. But if there's a rule in place that says you can only make so much money so that the people at the bottom are benefiting at the same time, that's the rule of the game. And you're not necessarily entitled to that. So anyways, yeah.
Okay, so like again, like the shoe and tell is one thing.
The what?
I guess the shoe and tell is one thing.
He just says this. All he says, I mean, as far as I can tell, he's saying that questions of distributive justice, how much money you make, the kind of job you get, well, any, again, from the perspective of economic justice, that's what we're talking about, economic justice. You deserve it? He thinks it's the wrong question. Because to deserve it places a lot of control on you, the individual. And what he's saying is, you as the individual are subject to a lot of contingency about what society values and about the kind of talents that you're going to have. So from that perspective, deserving more money than somebody else is not the right question. And these are where the examples, I think, help drive this point home. If you think about the examples of people that make a lot of money and we think it's kind of silly that they make a lot of money, I remember complaining from a young age and wondering why the hell professional athletes make so much damn money. Do you think it's fair that, is it fair that a teacher makes poverty level wages and a professional athlete makes hundreds of millions of dollars? And they get to basically not work for like half the year, depending on the sport you're talking. Is that fair? Or is that wrong? Is that a matter of what society just happens to value? We happen to value entertainment. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not a judgment about our society. But I think it calls into question the notion that baseball players, or I'm saying baseball players because I was just having an argument the other day with somebody, because I don't know how much you follow what's happening with the strike and the labor shortage in baseball. Part of what they were fighting for was to get the minimum salary raised for certain players, right? Because the athlete, you hear about like Mike Trout, you hear about these people that make, but most of the baseball players don't. They make pennies comparatively speaking, they don't make much at all. Well, they make more than the average person. They were just fighting for the minimum salary to be raised to something like $500,000 for the minimum salary, which again, just sounds kind of like that's the minimum salary, right? Like that's what you're fighting over. Now, again, I'm just saying that like, something like that can put it into perspective. Again, I'm not here to vilify the rich or vilify any of them, but when you put it in those terms, I mean, when you're talking about a minimum salary, that can seem kind of incredible to hear that they're fighting for baseball players to, at a minimum, make $500,000.
Is it gross or is that like profit?
I don't know exactly. I mean, I'm speaking roughly here from what I know. I'm speaking anecdotally here. I don't know the exact numbers.
Because there was a similar argument that came up with the UFC and fighter pay around that. Like they say maybe 100,000, but that has to go to training camps.
That's true.
injuries, Doctors.
Sure. I'm not, yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm not, you're right. It's not all just take home pay. Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, that, trying to figure out how to fit it into what we're talking about, but that seems, to me, that seems more like a product of whatever our system is. You know, like, it shows how much we value
It does.
entertainment and sports, you know, like, in one sense, we all have the equal opportunity to say, I mean, obviously, I know that coming down to individual characteristics, but we all generally have the same opportunity to pursue sport. You know, now whether you're physically right for that position, that's another thing. But you know, you're also choosing based on your personal, what you value in life. Like, do you want to be happy being fulfilled being a professor, or do you want to go make bullshit ton of money being an athlete?
I mean, sure, it is gonna come down to individual decisions about like what you're good at. And I'm not, again, but
I just think it's
But is
hard
it-
to
but is-
assess these things on like a societal scale because it
Oh.
doesn't take into account, like it assumes that everybody wants the same thing.
everybody does want, to some extent, they want the same thing. They want to be able to pursue their passion and get compensated fairly for it. And the question is, if you pursue your passion, if your passion is professional baseball, and yeah, we would say you're compensated fairly. If your passion is teaching, are you compensated fairly? Well, it doesn't seem like you are. So again, I think what you're pointing out is there is a contingency associated with what society values. But what Sandel asks us to imagine is imagine if we didn't value. What if we didn't value those things? What would the professional athletes do with their talents then? They'd be doing something else. Would we think less of them? No, I mean, you wouldn't know as much about them. Anyways, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I do think at the end of the day, there is something that all of us want. I think we all want to be, I mean, maybe you do want to say that you deserve, I don't know, there's a language of deserve, but like, you are entitled to fair compensation if you play by the rules of the system. So again, this is not to vilify professional athletes. If professional athletes play by the rules of the system, pursued their passion, pursued their talents, got ahead, great. Let them make the money. But if we had a policy, a tax policy, for example, that said, maybe we should not allow the professional athletes to get richer and richer at the expense of people at the bottom. If they're going to get richer and richer, then the people at the bottom need to come up at the same time. That's the difference.
Does Rawls take into account maybe the potential negatives associated with professions that give you higher income? Just saying, for example, you're Muhammad Ali. I know that example.
He does give it, yeah.
But Muhammad Ali ended up getting like he got Parkinson's, I believe, from all the head trauma he received. So would he then be compensated additionally because he got all that extra money, even though he got a shorter lifespan than say a teacher would?
Well, sure. I mean, I think if you think about concussions in football and things like that, that's a question that comes up even in football. There's discussions about concussions in football. I mean, some people might say, why the hell do we value watching football? And they're literally just like bashing their heads together like cavemen. I mean, I'm not trying to pick, I realize I'm a kid, so I gotta be careful. but yeah, I mean, that's a legitimate question. I mean, do they deserve some other form of compensation because their chosen profession has? I don't know, that's a good question. That's a good question. I mean, with that we would have to ask about the rules, I think. We have to ask about the rules of the system. Like, would we, in other words, should we have a rule in place that says, you are entitled to some form of compensation because your chosen path harms your quality of life when you're finished. So maybe that could be a rule that we could come up with in that system. I suppose that's possible. No, I don't, that's a good question. But I mean, I don't know. I just want to look at it. You guys don't have this, I know, but I just want to look at what Rawls says, right? Here's what he says at the top of, so just, he's quoting Rawls here. A just scheme then answers to what men are entitled to. It satisfies their legitimate expectations as founded on social institutions. So that's the distinction he makes. He says, justice is more a matter of what are you entitled to based on your expectations of the system. But what they are entitled to is not proportional to nor dependent on their intrinsic worth. And that would be this view of desert. That's saying, well, you know, you have some intrinsic worth as a professional athlete, and therefore we're going to reward you for that. You just happen to get lucky. The principles of justice that regulate the basic structure of society do not mention moral desert, and there is no tendency for distributed shares to correspond to it. Is that nice to read Sandel instead of Rawls? Right, because that's Rawls, you know, the technical jargon. But do you see what he's saying there? Do you follow what he says there? Principles of justice regulate the basic structure. Do not mention moral desert. There's no tendency. So then we go on. I mean, what about what he says there? Right? What about, I mean, I saw some people nodding their heads. I mean, is it, I guess this is like a fundamental question, but like, is the fact, tell us the fact that David Letterman makes $31 million a year and a school teacher makes $43,000. Is that unfair? It is.
I mean, I think it's partly unfair, but it's more unlucky because we can't choose. Like, we can't choose what society values. So I think it's unfair, but it's more unlucky than it is unfair.
But if we acknowledge the luck involved, does that mean we should try to do something?
Yes.
And I think that's what Rawls is trying to push us to see. Because I think this really cuts to the core of the disagreement between Milton Friedman and Rawls. So he gives this quote from Milton Friedman, and Milton Friedman, who's kind of really a staunch sort of libertarian. Again, I could be slightly misstated here, but his economic vision is more along these lines. And he agrees with Rawls. So quoting this Friedman guy says, look, life isn't fair. It's tempting to believe that the government can rectify what nature has spawned. What's he saying? It is tempting to believe that the government can rectify what nature has spawned. What's he saying?
Saying that there is an issue that the government might not be able to correct.
It is also important to recognize how much we benefit from the very unfairness we deplore. There's nothing fair about Muhammad Ali's been born with the skill. It certainly isn't fair that Muhammad Ali should be able to earn millions of dollars in one night. But wouldn't it have been even more unfair to the people who enjoyed watching him if, in the pursuit of some abstract ideal of equality, Muhammad Ali had not been permitted to earn more for one night's fight than the lowest man on the totem pole could get for a day's unskilled work on the grounds? So Friedman, I think, at least as far as I can tell, and this is what Sandel kind of interprets Friedman as kind of resigned to our fate. That, yeah, there is a lot of luck involved. There is. So even the libertarian economists would acknowledge that there is a lot of luck and contingency involved in what you achieve in your life. You don't necessarily deserve it. But we could reach one of two conclusions. We could say, because you don't deserve it, because there's a lot of luck and contingency involved, we could say, we should try to do something about it. Or we could just say, no, that oversteps too much. That the government oversteps that point. And that we should just, at the end of the day, leave it up to market forces, so to speak, to try and, in other words, for the government to try to level things out would be overstepping what the government should do. And I think what he's interpreting is that and this is an objection I get from you guys sometimes, I feel like, is that life's unfair. But I often think, like, sometimes it's like, so because we say life's unfair, does that mean we should do something about it? Should we try to do something about it, or should we? I mean, I think that's what Rawls goes on to say, right? Rawls, I think sometimes people, right? So here's what Rawls says, right? In other words, he says the way things are does not determine the way they ought to be. Simply because life is unfair does not mean we just have to somehow accept that is like a brute, hard, cold fact of reality. Say, I mean, anyways, we don't have to, because at least that's what Rawls is saying. I'm not saying that, that's what Rawls is saying, right? Rawls says we should reject the contention that the ordering of it. So look at this passage with me closely. I'm going to go through this. We should, because this is really important. We should reject the contention that the ordering of institutions is always defective because the distribution of natural talents and the contingencies of social circumstances are unjust, and this injustice must inevitably carry over to human arrangements. What's he saying there? We should reject the contention that the ordering of institutions is always defective because the distribution of natural talents and contingencies of social circumstance are unjust. What's he saying? I mean, I think just saying, just because naturally things are a bit unfair, because some people are born with more favorable genetic circumstances and more favorable, social circumstances, like that doesn't mean that we should just look at that. We shouldn't just look at the way things are and say, well, and then if somebody gets rich and somebody ends up poor, we just say, well, that was up to them if they wanted to work harder.
I had a Spanish teacher in high school, and he always said, don't fall into the trap of complacency. And that's what that sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so he does use the words of complacency, right? He does, right? What Sandel says is, in a theory of justice, Rawls rejects the counsel of complacence that Friedman's view reflects. So then Rawls goes on to say, occasionally this, if I had time, I'd bring it up. This is kind of a dense passage. But he says, occasionally this reflection is offered as an excuse for ignoring injustice, as if the refusal to acquiesce in injustice is on par with being unable to accept death. Right, I mean, that's kind of that's what he's saying. He's basically saying that, I mean, the idea of life being unfair, I think, and saying life isn't fair, I think some people say that as if it's just something you have to accept about human existence. Just accept that life is unfair. Don't try to do anything about it. We're all going to die eventually anyways. So do the best you can while you're here. And, some people are going to be more lucky than others, but that's not something we should try to do anything about. He goes on to say the natural distribution is neither just nor unjust, right? So there's nothing unjust or just about the fact that Michael Jordan was born to be a great basketball player. That's just a fact. These are simply facts. What is just and unjust are the way that institutions deal with these facts. That's justice. How do we attempt to, okay, go ahead.
Well, it just seems like the more you took the word inequalities to its basis definition, like the thing that makes things unequal are being different. So if you wanted to take that all the way to the core, like feel like there could, and I understand where you're coming from and where Rawls is coming from, like, we should try to, you know, make inequalities less oppressive on people. I do understand that, but I feel like it's like getting closer and closer to equating inequalities with differences. And like, I feel like we as individuals and society place a pretty big value on that. And so if you just try to get rid of all the inequalities, then everybody's gonna be the same. It'll just be like one big uniform robot population.
Yeah, and I don't think that Rawls is not trying to get rid of all inequalities. He's trying to say that
He's trying to like mitigate the worst of inequality.
natural differences are fine. Some people are born with more advantageous genetics and social circumstances than others. We're not punishing you for going out and doing those things. But
Just
at the end of the day,
divide and line.
well, at the end of the day, this is social. I said this, I was trying to say this to you after class before, but this is social contract theory. And insofar as we're talking about, we are asking ourselves to share something with each other. We have to, when we said, so Rawls says we need to share one another's faith. That's kind of the social aspect of the contract, is that we are, I mean, Rawls' social contract is obviously asking us, it's demanding a bit more than the other social contracts that we've looked at. There's just more involved in the contract. Rawls wants there to be more involved in the contract. Sharing one another's fate means acknowledging that we all are subject to contingency, all of us. Some of us end up on the better end of that contingency. Some of us end up on the worst end of that contingency. He wants all of us to acknowledge that we're all subject to the same forces of contingency. And that if we make that acknowledgement, what might we realize? I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to sell Rawls. It is when he says share our fate. I think that's what he said. Our fate is to be subject to circumstances that we don't control. So if we all acknowledge that together, everyone says we are all subject to circumstances we don't control. What kind of realizations will we make? I think that's what he's trying to get us to think about. He says share our fate.
You think, like, I think of like our entitlements are subjected to these.
How so?
Well, like what is seen to be as entitlement is subjected to contingencies that kind of dictate where you can, like, what's fair.
Well, yes, I mean, there's no doubt that what you're going to end up being entitled to is going to depend on a lot of things about the society you live in. Yeah. But even if Barry Bonds or Mike Trout, is that a better contemporary example, is entitled to all of his money. If he's entitled to it, he played by the rules, he earned it fairly, he played by the rules. Even if, maybe Mike Trout could stop and say, man, I'm really lucky that I live in a world where hitting a ball is valued a lot. Maybe I'm really lucky to be living in that world. And what kind of conclusion? So anyways, I don't know, that's just the kind of thing. Like, I'm really lucky to be in that world. And some people aren't so lucky. So what should maybe I have some obligation to those people who aren't so lucky. I don't know. I'm just putting it out there. I'm not saying you have to buy it, but I think that's the vision of what Rawls is trying to give us. Anyways, this is, we're over time. So I'll post the topics for the quiz. And I'll see you on Wednesday.